Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications. Now let's get right into today's video. John Wayne Gacy Jr., aka the Killer Clown, was born on March 17, 1942 at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Northwood Park Township, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public performances as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, personas he devised before the discovery of his crimes. John was the second child and only son of John Stanley Gacy. His father was an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. Gacy was of Polish and Danish ancestry, and his family was Catholic. His parental grandparents had immigrated to the U.S. from Poland. Gacy was close to his mother and two sisters, but endured a difficult relationship with his father, an alcoholic who was physically abusive to his family. The elder Gacy frequently belittled his son, calling him dumb and stupid, and comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest memories was of his father beating him with a leather belt for accidentally disarranging components of a car engine he had assembled. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which only resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy who would probably grow up queer. Despite his mistreatment, however, Gacy still loved his father, but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. In 1949, Gacy's father was informed that his son and another boy had been caught sexually fondling a young girl. His father whipped him with a razor strop as a punishment. The same year, a family friend and contractor would sometimes molest Gacy in his truck. Gacy never told his father about this, afraid his father would blame him. Gacy was an overweight and unathletic child. Because of a heart condition, he was told to avoid all sports at school. During the 4th grade, Gacy began to experience blackouts. He was hospitalized on occasion because of these episodes, and also in 1957 for a burst appendix. Gacy later estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he spent almost a year in the hospital and attributed the decline of his grades to missing school. His father suspected these episodes were an effort to gain sympathy and attention, and openly accused his son of faking the condition, as Gacy lay in hospital in bed. Although his mother, sisters, and a few close friends never doubted his illness, Gacy's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. One of Gacy's friends in high school recalled several instances when his father ridiculed or beat his son without provocation. On one occasion, in 1957, he witnessed Gacy's father emerging drunk from the basement to begin belittling, then hitting his son for no apparent reason. Gacy's mother attempted to intervene as her son simply put up his hands to defend himself. According to the friend, Gacy never struck his father back during these altercations. In 1960, at age 18, Gacy became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a Democratic Party candidate in his neighborhood. This led to more criticism from his father, who accused his son of being a patsy. Gacy later speculated his decision to become involved in politics was actually to seek the acceptance from others that he never received from his father. The same year Gacy's political involvement began, his father bought him a car. He kept the vehicle title in his own name until Gacy had finished paying for it. These monthly payments took several years for him to complete. His father would confiscate the keys to the vehicle if Gacy did not do as he said. In 1962, Gacy purchased an extra set of keys after his father confiscated the original set. In response, his father removed the distributor cap, keeping the component for 3 days. Gacy recalled he felt totally sick and drained after this incident. Hours after his father replaced the distributor cap, Gacy left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada. He found work within the ambulance service before he was transferred to work as an attendant at Palm Mortuary. As a mortuary attendant, Gacy slept on a cot behind the embalming room. He worked there for 3 months, observing morticians embalming dead bodies and occasionally serving as a pallbearer. Gacy later confessed that one evening, while alone, he had clambered into the coffin of a deceased teenage male, embracing and caressing the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This prompted Gacy to call his mother the next day and ask whether his father would allow him to return home. His father agreed, and on the same day he drove back to Chicago. On returning home, Gacy enrolled at Northwestern Business College, despite having failed to graduate from high school. He graduated in 1963 and took a management training position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company. In 1964, the shoe company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois, to work as a salesman, and eventually promoted him to manager of his department. In March of that year, he became engaged to Marilyn Myers, a co-worker. During their courtship, Gacy joined the local Jaycees and worked tirelessly for them, being named key man in April 1964. That same year, he had his second homosexual experience. According to Gacy, after one of his colleagues in the Springfield Jaycees plied him with drinks and invited him to spend the evening on his sofa, he agreed. The colleague then performed oral sex on him while he was drunk. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield Jaycees. The same year, he was named the third most outstanding Jaycee in the state of Illinois. After a 6-month courtship, Gacy and Myers married in September 1964. Marilyn's father subsequently purchased 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken (KFC) restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved there so Gacy could manage the restaurants, with the understanding that they would move into Marilyn's parents' former home, which had been vacated for the couple. The offer was lucrative. Gacy would receive $15,000 per year, the equivalent of about $144,000 as of 2023, plus a share of the restaurant's profits. Following the obligatory completion of a management course, Gacy relocated to Waterloo with his wife. He opened a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Although Gacy employed teenagers of both sexes at his restaurants, he socialized only with the young men. Gacy gave many of them alcohol before he made sexual advances. If they rebuffed him, he would claim his advances were simply jokes or a test of morals. Gacy's wife gave birth to a son in February 1966 and a daughter in March 1967. Gacy later described this period of his life as perfect. He had finally earned his father's approval. When Gacy's parents paid a family visit in July 1966, his father privately apologized for the physical and emotional abuse he had inflicted throughout his son's childhood and adolescence before happily saying, "Son, I was wrong about you," as he shook Gacy's hand. In Waterloo, Gacy joined the local Jaycees chapter, regularly offering extended hours to the organization in addition to the 12 and 14-hour days he worked managing the 3 KFC restaurants. At meetings, Gacy often provided fried chicken and insisted on being called Colonel. He and other Waterloo Jaycees were also deeply involved in wife-swapping, prostitution, pornography, and drug use. Although Gacy was considered ambitious and something of a braggart, the other Jaycees held him in high regard for his fundraising work, and in 1967 named him Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo Jaycees. The same year, Gacy served on the board of directors. In August 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees Jr., the son of Donald E. Voorhees, a local politician and fellow Jaycee. Gacy lured Voorhees to his house upon the promise of showing him heterosexual stag films, regularly played at Jaycee's events. Gacy plied Voorhees with alcohol, allowed him to watch a stag movie, then persuaded him to engage in mutual oral sex, adding, "You have to have sex with a man before you start having sex with women." Over the following months, Gacy similarly abused several other youths, including one whom he encouraged to have sex with his wife, before blackmailing him into performing oral sex on him. Gacy tricked several teenagers into believing he was commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments in the interests of scientific research and paid them up to $50 each. In 1968, Voorhees reported to his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Voorhees Sr. immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy and subsequently charged him with performing oral sodomy on Voorhees and the attempted assault of 16-year-old Edward Lynch. Gacy vehemently denied the charges and demanded to take a polygraph test. The results indicated Gacy was nervous when he denied any wrongdoing about both men. Gacy publicly denied any wrongdoing and insisted the charges against him were politically motivated. Voorhees Sr. had opposed Gacy's nomination for appointment as president of the Iowa Jaycees. Several fellow Jaycees found Gacy's story credible and rallied to his support. However, on May 10, 1968, Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charge. Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys and buried 26 of them in the crawl space of his house. His victims included people he knew and random individuals, lured from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, Buck Square, or simply off the streets, with the promise of a job with PDM, an offer of drink and/or drugs, or money for sex. Some victims were grabbed by force, others were conned into believing Gacy was a policeman. Gacy usually lured a lone victim to his house, although on more than one occasion, Gacy also had what he called doubles, 2 victims killed in the same evening. Inside Gacy's home, his usual modus operandi was to ply a youth with drink and drugs, or generally gain his trust. He would then produce a pair of handcuffs to show a magic trick, sometimes as part of a clowning routine. He typically cuffed his own hands behind his back, then surreptitiously released himself with the key, which he hid between his fingers. He then offered to show his intended victim how to release himself from the handcuffs. With his victim manacled and unable to free himself, Gacy then made a statement to the effect that, "The trick is, you have to have the key." Gacy referred to this act of restraining his victim as the handcuff trick. Having restrained his victim, Gacy proceeded to rape and torture his captive. He frequently began sitting on or straddling himself above his victim's chest, before forcing the victim to fillet him. Gacy then inflicted acts of torture, including burning with cigars, making his captive imitate a horse as he sat on their back and pulled upon makeshift reins around their necks, and violating with foreign objects such as dildos and prescription bottles after he had sodomized his captive. To immobilize his captive's legs before engaging in acts of torture, Gacy frequently manacled their ankles to a 2x4 with handcuffs attached at each end, an act inspired by the Houston mass murders. He also verbally taunted many of his victims throughout their continued abuse, and was known to have dragged or forced several victims to crawl into his bathroom, where he partly drowned them in the bathtub before repeatedly reviving them, enabling him to continue his prolonged assault. In instances where a victim had pleaded to be killed, as opposed to continuing to endure torture, Gacy would make a statement to the effect he would kill his victim when he wanted to. Gacy typically murdered his victims by placing a rope tourniquet around their necks before progressively tightening the rope with a hammer handle. He referred to this act as the rope trick, frequently informing his captive, "This is the last trick." In at least one instance, he had read part of Psalm 23 as he tightened the rope around his victim's neck. Occasionally, the victim had convulsed for an hour or two before dying, although several victims died by asphyxiation from cloth rags stuffed deep into their throats. Except for his 2 final victims, all were murdered between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. After death, Gacy usually stored the victims' bodies under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying his victim in the crawlspace, where he periodically poured quicklime to hasten the decomposition of his victims. Some victims' bodies were taken to his garage and embalmed before their burial. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, and charged with 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garippo. The jury was selected from Rockford because of extensive press coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester in the year before his trial. He underwent a variety of psychological tests before a panel of psychiatrists to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorders. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hard-working, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a policeman called Jack Henley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. When Gacy had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty because of insanity to the charges against him. Presenting Gacy as a Jekyll and Hyde character, the defense produced several psychiatric experts who had examined Gacy. 3 psychiatric experts at Gacy's trial testified they found him to be paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. The prosecutors presented the case that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. To support this contention, they produced several witnesses to testify to the premeditation of Gacy's actions and the efforts he took to escape detection. Those doctors refuted the defense doctors' claims of multiple personalities and insanity. Graham and Rossi testified that Gacy had made them dig drainage ditches and spread bags of lime in his crawlspace. Both said Gacy looked periodically into the crawlspace to ensure they and other employees they supervised did not deviate from the precise locations he had marked. On February 18th, Robert Stein testified that all the bodies recovered from Gacy's property were markedly decomposed and putrefied skeletonized remains, and that of all the autopsies he performed, 13 victims had died of asphyxiation, 6 of ligature strangulation, 1 of multiple stab wounds to the chest, and then undetermined ways. When Gacy's defense team suggested that all 33 deaths were caused by accidental erotic asphyxia, Stein called this highly improbable. Jeffrey Rignall testified on behalf of the defense on February 21st, recounting his ordeal. Rignall wept repeatedly while describing Gacy's torture of him in March 1978. Asked whether Gacy appreciated the criminality of his actions, Rignall said he believed that Gacy was unable to conform his actions to the law's expectations because of the beastly and animalistic ways he attacked me. During specific cross-examination relating to the torture, Rignall vomited and was excused from further testimony. On February 29th, Donald Voorhees, whom Gacy sexually assaulted in 1967, testified to his ordeal at Gacy's hands and his subsequent attempts to dissuade him from testifying by paying another youth to spray mace in his face and beat him. Voorhees felt unable to testify but did briefly attempt to do so before being asked to step down. Ronald Donnelly testified the week after Voorhees, recounting his ordeal at Gacy's hands in December 1977. Donnelly was visibly distressed as he recalled the abuse he endured and came close to breaking down several times. As Donnelly testified, Gacy repeatedly laughed at him, but Donnelly finished his testimony. During Donnelly's cross-examination, one of Gacy's defense attorneys, Robert Motta, attempted to discredit his testimony, but Donnelly did not waver from his testimony of what had occurred. During the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Garippo, requesting a mistrial for reasons including that he did not approve of his lawyer's insanity plea, that his lawyers had not allowed him to take the witness stand, that his defense had not called enough medical witnesses, and that the police were lying about verbal statements he had allegedly made to detectives after his arrest, and that in any event, the statements were self-serving for use by the prosecution. Judge Garippo addressed Gacy's letter by informing him that both counsels had not been denied the opportunity or funds to summon expert witnesses to testify, and that under the law, he had the choice whether he wished to testify, and was free to indicate as much to the judge if he wished to do so. On March 11th, final arguments by both prosecution and defense attorneys began. They concluded the following day. Prosecuting attorney Terry Sullivan spoke first, outlining Gacy's history of abusing youths, the testimony of his efforts to avoid detection, and describing his surviving victims Voorhees and Donnelly as living dead. Referring to Gacy as the worst of all murderers, Sullivan stated, "John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes. But one must tremble. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all." After the states for our closing, counsel Sam Amarante spoke for the defense. Amarante argued against the testimony delivered by the doctors who had testified for the prosecution, repeatedly citing the testimony of the 4 psychiatrists and psychologists who had testified on behalf of the defense. Amarante also accused Sullivan of scarcely referring to the evidence presented throughout the trial in his closing argument, and of arousing hatred against his client. The defense lawyer attempted to portray Gacy as a man driven by compulsions he was unable to control, contending the state had not met his burden of proving Gacy sane beyond a reasonable doubt. In support of these arguments, the defense referred to the testimony of the doctors who had appeared for the defense, in addition to defense witnesses such as Jeffrey Ringall and a former business associate of Gacy's named Michael Reed, both of whom had testified to their belief that Gacy had been unable to control his actions. Amarante then urged the jury to put aside any prejudice they held against his client, and asked they deliver a verdict of not guilty because of insanity, adding that Gacy was a danger to both himself and others, and that studying his psychology and behavior would be of benefit to science. On the morning of March 12th, William Kunkel continued to argue for the prosecution. Kunkel referred to the defense's contention of insanity as a sham, arguing that the facts of the case demonstrated Gacy's ability to think logically and control his actions. Kunkel also referred to the testimony of one of the doctors who had examined Gacy in 1968 and had concluded he was an antisocial personality capable of committing crimes without remorse and unlikely to benefit from social or psychiatric treatment, stating that had the recommendations of his doctor been heeded, Gacy would not have been freed. At the close of his argument, Kunkel removed photos of Gacy's 22 identified victims from the display board and asked the jury not to show sympathy, but to show justice. Kunkel then asked the jury to show the same sense of sympathy this man showed when he took these lives and put them there, before throwing the stack of photos into the opening of the trapdoor from Gacy's crawlspace, which had been introduced as evidence and was on display in the courtroom. After Kunkel had finished his testimony, the jury retired to consider their verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found Gacy guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both convictions about Robert Piest. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing Gacy to death for each murder committed, after the Illinois statute on capital punishment came into effect in June 1977. His execution was set for June 2, 1980. On being sentenced, Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center, where he remained incarcerated on death row for 14 years. Before his trial, Gacy initiated contact with WLS-TV journalist Russ Ewing, to whom he granted numerous interviews between 1979 and 1981. Ewing later collaborated with author Tim Cahill to publish the book Buried Dreams. The information Gacy divulged to Ewing regarding the circumstances of his first murder would prove instrumental in establishing the identity of his first victim. On February 15, 1983, Henry Brisbane, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 Killer, stabbed Gacy in the upper arm with a sharpened wire as Gacy was participating in a voluntary work program. A second death row inmate injured in the attack, William Jones, received a superficial stab wound to the head. Both received treatment in the prison hospital for their wounds. After his incarceration, Gacy read numerous law books and filed voluminous motions and appeals, although he did not prevail in any of them. His appeals related to issues such as the validity of the first search warrant, granted to the Des Plaines Police on December 13, 1978, and his objection to his lawyer's insanity plea defense at his trial. Gacy also contended that, although he had some knowledge of the 5 murders, those of McCoy, Butkovich, Godjic, Schitz, and Piest, the other 28 murders had been committed by employees who had keys to his house while he was away on business trips. In mid-1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and ordered his execution by lethal injection on November 14th. Gacy filed an appeal against this decision, which was denied by the Supreme Court of the United States on March 4, 1985. The following year, Gacy filed a further post-conviction petition seeking a new trial. His then defense lawyer, Richard Kling, argued that Gacy had been provided with ineffective legal counsel at his 1980 trial. This post-conviction petition was dismissed on September 11, 1986. Gacy accepted the 1985 decision that he be executed. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction on September 29, 1988, setting a new execution date of January 11, 1989. After the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gacy's final appeal in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court formally set an execution date for May 10, 1994. On the morning of May 9, 1994, Gacy was transferred from the Menard Correctional Center to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That evening, he observed prayer with a Catholic priest, from whom he received the last rites, before being escorted to the Stateville execution chamber to receive a lethal injection. Before the execution began, the chemicals used to effect the execution solidified unexpectedly, clogging the IV tube used to administer the chemicals into Gacy's arm, complicating the procedure. Blinds covering the window through which witnesses observed the execution were drawn. The execution team replaced the clogged tube. After 10 minutes, the blinds were reopened and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem of the prison officials' inexperience at conducting an execution, saying that had correct execution procedures been followed, the complications would never have occurred. This error led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. On this subject, one prosecutor at Gacy's trial, William Kunkel, said he got a much easier death than any of his victims. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others, and that the state was murdering him. His final spoken words were reported to be "kiss my ass," although prosecutor William Kunkel states these words were spoken to the prison official, and not part of any official statement before Gacy's execution. In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd estimated at over 1,000 gathered outside the correctional center. A vocal majority were in favor of the execution, although a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some of those in favor of the execution wore T-shirts, hearkening to Gacy's previous community services as a clown, and bearing satirical slogans such as "No tears for the clown." The anti-death penalty protesters present observed a silent candlelight vigil. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, His brain was removed. It is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who has interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. His body was cremated.